Broadcasting from Millvale Studios, you are listening to Funny Money on the River's Edge Network. I'm your host, Tom Henry, and with me is our producer tonight, Tom Benoit, who was a longtime producer of this show. And tonight, but what we haven't seen in a while. Tonight, we're going to talk about the major exchanges. And I thought of this clever remark, and that so I'm going to repeat it because I repeated it online. And that is that while everyone is talking about gift exchanges, we are talking about the major exchanges. So we're going to be talking about the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq. Now, these are really what we're talking about, though, is the parent companies that own these exchanges. And in the case of the first one I'm talking about, it's a big company with a diverse set of different exchanges. It's called the Intercontinental Exchange Corp. And you may not have heard of that, but you've surely heard of the New York Stock Exchange, which is the most prominent exchange in the world. London Stock Exchange is pretty big too, but I would say the New York Stock Exchange has the dominant reputation for being the hub of, trading equity in the world. Now, so my sources here are Wikipedia, and I'm also going to quote extensively from a New York Times article called Buying the NYSE, which stands for New York Stock Exchange, in one shot. January 2013, written by Nathaniel Popper. That is, 2013 was the year when the Intercontinental Exchange acquired the New York Stock Exchange. I'm also going to use facts and figures from WSJ.com, which is the Wall Street Journal's website. So we'll start off talking about Jeff Sprecher. Born in Madison, Wisconsin, to an insurance salesman and a medical technician in 1955, Jeff Sprecher was the kind of kid who liked to take things apart and put them back together again. Now, that was his sister said that about him, Jill. So I'm going to roll with it. This would serve him well, and he went on to James Madison Memorial High School and then got a bachelor, fancy that, James Madison Memorial High School in Madison, Wisconsin. He got a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1978. So chemical engineering, that's pretty far removed from, running a stock exchange. But you'll find a lot of people in finance have engineering degrees. He also got an MBA from Pepperdine University in 1984. That's more like it. In college, he was in the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity, and he got his first job after college as a salesman for the industrial company Trane, Trane, thanks to good grades and a reputation for being the life of the party at Sigma Alpha Epsilon. So, there is a silver lining to being the party guy. It's not all spears and daggers thrown at you after graduating. Well, especially if you can get good grades too. I mean, if you can be both, that's awesome. He accepted the job because it took him to Southern California. And in an interview with the New York Times for this article, which I'm going to quote a lot very soon, he said, quote, "It was the ticket to the beach and palm trees and girls on roller skates. And I was like, that's what I want to do in life." Us guys can relate to that. So today, ICE, or the Intercontinental Exchange, everyone on Wall Street calls it ICE. And they go, ice, ice, baby, whenever it goes up. I used to own this stock. I don't anymore. ICE operates 23 regulated exchanges and marketplaces. All right. But I want to talk about Sprecher a little more. All right. So, in this, now I'm going to read directly from the New York Times article. Okay. This is his sister. She says, he stayed with his sister in New York for a little while. And she says, everything he touched always made money, whereas everything I touched lost money. She writes and directs independent films. You can imagine. What has happened to him since 2000 is beyond my comprehension, she says. Mr. Sprecker's first job. Oh, okay. I told you about that. Train. Okay. While at Train, he made an early sales pitch to William Prentice, an entrepreneur who was developing power plants. It was 1983, and the nation's electricity market had just been deregulated, allowing entrepreneurs to start their own power plants, which only utilities had been allowed to do in the past. So, it's still like dominated by utilities now, but if you want to, you can get into the power plant market. It's really tough with all the regulations, though. Mr. Prentice, impressed that Mr. Sprecher recognized the industry was in the middle of big changes, almost immediately offered him a job at his new company, the Western Power Group. This is a quote. He had already internalized the whole concept of creative destruction, Mr. Prentice says. Now, if you don't know this, creative destruction is something that was, I think it was first penned by Joseph Schumpeter, and it's kind of the basis or one of the main themes of capitalism, and that is that you start a company, but over the years, what you're doing is going to become silly at some point, like the typewriter company now, and so the destroying that company, liquidating the assets of that company, enables other companies or those resources to be put to other means that are more productive in today's society. That's just one example. There are also many, like if a company is poorly managed. And I think that we kind of defied that in 2008 by bailing out the banks. The banks had made, some really bad loans, and that was their decision to make those loans. But we bailed them out and prevented them. We kept them in business and prevented them from liquidating their assets and allowing those assets to go to better places, in my opinion. Obviously there were a lot of banks that didn't need to be bailed out too. J.P. Morgan's one of those. Okay, so Western Power, this new company that Sprecker's working for, got off to a rocky start. It almost failed when a Canadian company threatened to corner its local energy supply, which was cow manure. Others at the Western Power Group grew despondent. Now that's so all right, so we're talking about, 1980s, early 80s, and they're using alternative energy. Cow manure. All right, so Mr. Sprecher and Mr. Prentice spent weeks in a motel in California's Imperial Valley trying to persuade the suppliers to change their minds. We called it the Manure Wars, Mr. Prentice said. Neither myself nor Jeff questioned the need to go and fight. There was never any second guessing. It was just do it and win. When they did, after Mr. Prentice sold his stake in the company a few years later, Mr. Sprecher continued building the Western Power Group until another round of electricity deregulation in 1996. And then he pounced. Previously, power plant owners who wanted to buy and sell surplus electricity had to call one another and agree on a price. Mr. Sprecher saw opportunity in an Atlanta company that provided an electronic trading network. He bought that company, the Continental Power Exchange, with his own money. He ended up putting $4 million into it. So by this point in time, he had, made some coin. Also, this is kind of like what Enron did, if you're familiar with that. Although Mr. Sprecher kept his company in California in his house in Beverly Hills. Oh, yeah, he made a lot of money, apparently. Mm-hmm. He spent every spare hour trying aggressively to sign up utility companies for the Atlanta Exchange. His team made many visits to Enron, where they met with top executives like Jeffrey Skilling, who is now serving time in prison. Jeff Skilling was a big deal. And I don't know if you know anything about it, but Enron got in really big trouble for essentially cooking the books. Those meetings ended one day when the Enron executives began asking a number of technical questions about Mr. Sprecher's system. We sat there in the meeting and we realized these guys are building this themselves and we are educating them, Mr. Sprecher recalls. Shortly thereafter, Enron started its own electricity and trading platform, which quickly came to dominate the industry. It looked like the Continental Exchange was done, but Enron made one big mistake. Rather than providing a place for buyers and sellers to meet, Enron itself bought from every seller and sold to every buyer. This angered Wall Street banks that were among the biggest traders of energy products. When Mr. Sprecher showed up in New York to stay with his two sisters in 2000, nearly ready to give up on his own system, he didn't know that Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs had been looking for someone just like him who could provide an alternative to Enron. They say Enron made one big mistake. I would say they made at least two. All right. As Mr. Sprecher shuttled between meetings at the two banks, the bankers were trading phone calls and buzzing. We were all thinking, this is the guy we want, recalls John A. Shapiro, who was involved in the talks at Morgan Stanley. We'd already talked to a number of people, and the difference was night and day. The difference wasn't that the Atlanta Exchange's technology, said people who were involved. It was Mr. Sprecher himself. At some point, you said, okay, this guy has got something going for him. It's hard to put your finger on it, but you know it when you see it, Mr. Shapiro recalls. Remember, he was the life of the party. On the other side, it was the perfect time to be hooking up with Wall Street, as banks were focusing increasingly on trading. In the negotiations that followed, Mr. Sprecher used what would become a trademark strategy, giving up part of the ownership of his company in exchange for a promise that the recipients would use his platform. In this case, he gave up 80% of the ownership in the two banks. The banks soon turned around and gave up part of their own stakes to several of the largest power companies, including Shell, Total, and British Petroleum, which continued to use what was soon rechristened as the Intercontinental Exchange. All right, so really he built this thing up as an energy exchange, like Enron. All right, and then when Enron collapsed in scandal, the business began pouring in. By their own account, Mr. Sprecher and his wife, Miss Leffler, live for ICE. Okay, ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange. He has some hobbies. Now back to Sprecher. He has some hobbies, and his sister Jill wonders how he has the time to watch cooking shows and reality television. But he and his wife have no children. Miss Leffler, the more serious of the two, says that the thing that brought them together was their willingness and desire to do their jobs around the clock. We both just work all the time and enjoy work, Miss Leffler says. Okay, that's different than me. Both revel in the brinksmanship that has marked ICE's climb. 2 days before Mr. Sprecher and his Wall Street bankers announced the creation of ICE in 2000, they offered the New York Mercantile Exchange, or NYMEX, a 10% stake in the new business if NYMEX would share some of its back office services. While Mr. Sprecher was giving his presentation to the board, a director said, "Who the hell brought this guy into our board meeting?" Mr. Sprecher recalled, then the room went silent. The next thing he knew, a guard was escorting him out of the building. So he's like kind of like an aggressive guy who gets in there and sells, his company. And he went, like, to get the New York Stock Exchange, he was cold calling all these people at Goldman Sachs and stuff in New York. And they were like, what? But eventually someone listened. And he was able to buy the New York Stock Exchange, which is amazing. This guy who was born in Madison, Wisconsin, didn't really have, any kind of special education, but was good in school. He managed to single-handedly create this energy exchange, which was situated properly, and he built it up and then was able to acquire the most reputable stock exchange in the world. Here's another quote. He has the capability to disarm people. You might even say charm people into accepting his soft-spoken demeanor, says Frederick Soenhut, who was the chairman of the New York Board of Trade. Now, okay. Now they're talking about like before he bought the New York Stock Exchange, he bought this New York Board of Trade. Okay, and as soon as that deal went through, Mr. Sprecher was seldom seen. What's more, he put a manager in his 30s in charge of the New York operations. Mr. Sprecher says that was intentional. I wanted to show that the market that there was a much younger, aggressive guy here who really wanted to fundamentally change the company, he says. ICE didn't have to do much to initiate the change. It allowed customers to choose between trading on the floor or on ICE's electrical system. Within months, most customers had migrated to the screen. That situation caused so much job loss and unhappiness that when ICE made its next takeover bid for the Chicago Board of Trade, a crew of New York Board of Trade traders took out newspaper ads warning the Chicago traders, watch their backs. ICE ultimately lost that battle, but only after almost derailing a rival bid by slipping an offer under a hotel room door. So this guy just likes to get things done one way or the other, ICE also attracted the ire of a number of Democratic senators who said it was encouraging speculation that caused fluctuations in the price of essential commodities like oil. But Mr. Sprecher proved adept at defanging his political opponents by bending to their will. Tell me what the rules are, and I'll figure out how we can make money around them, is one of his common lines when talking to regulators in Washington. Since the financial crisis, Mr. Sprecher has used that attitude to position himself to take advantage of changes being brought on by the Dodd-Frank bank financial overhaul. Soon, Wall Street firms will have to move trading into... Okay, now this was written in 2013, so this has already happened to a large extent. But this is also critical. Because of Dodd-Frank, a lot of the trading that is done like off of exchanges has to migrate onto exchanges. But and that would mean more business for companies like ICE and Nasdaq. But the thing is that Trump has talked about rolling back Dodd-Frank, or at least some of it. So we don't know what's going to happen there. That might not actually, it's going to, more and more of these trades are supposed to be done on actual exchanges. But now that Trump has talked about rolling back Dodd-Frank, we don't really know if that's actually going to come to fruition or not. A lot of them have already come on, though. Okay, so he bought the New York Stock Exchange with this company, which is amazing. And now ICE operates 23 regulated exchanges and marketplaces and is worth north of $34 billion. It's like 34.6, I think. Yeah. So this is a great company, that has done a lot and is obviously really well managed. Jeff Sprecher still runs it. The PE is 23.46. It has, which is, kind of high for this type of company. It has a 1.19% dividend. Return on invested capital 7.47%. So the PE is quite a bit higher than the ROIC percent, which is a metric that I like to look at, just a little rule of thumb. I like to see the PE close to the ROIC percent. But it's not black and white, like if it's not close, it's no good. It's still, there's still other things you have to consider. One of them is net debt to equity, 33.3%. So I see like I consider about 65% net debt to equity to be the threshold of what is acceptable and what is not really. But that you can overlook that also, depending on other factors. But since it's 33.3%, that's quite a bit lower than the threshold. So I consider that to be a good balance sheet. So that's a plus. Now here's a big plus. Growth is expected to be 20.6% for the fiscal year 2016, to be up 20.6% from 2015. So it's growing really well, and I would expect it to grow even more in 2017. Trump has talked a lot about doing things like having tax cuts that will tend to stimulate trading, because if you cut corporate taxes, that's going to add a lot to earnings, and that should stimulate trading. But on the other hand, this company, because it's so diversified all over the world, it only pays a 21.7% tax rate. So that means that a lot of the operations are in foreign countries where they have lower tax rates. So it won't directly benefit from a tax cut as much as a company, an exchange that were just in the United States would. So I think this is a decent buy. I would still give it a thumbs up, but I would prefer the other company that we're going to talk about next. And in fact, I would also prefer one that we're not going to talk about, another exchange, and that's CBOE, Chicago Board of Options Exchange. So please look at those two as preferable to this one. But I do think this one's going to go up. In 2014 was $45. Now it's $57.30. I wouldn't be surprised to see that hit 70 next year. Okay, that's it for that one. And now we're going to take a little break.
You didn't wash your hands! People who do not wash their hands should be fined. And I'm sorry, I don't know about all of you, but if you're gonna castrate me, you might as well just kill me! So enjoy your hot dog, you jackass!
Get Educated with Brian Crawford, live Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
Okay, and here we go. Welcome back. The next company, we're talking about exchanges, and the next exchange I want to talk about is the Nasdaq. Now, this was kind of a breakthrough exchange when it was created back in the 70s. My sources for this one were just Wikipedia and WSJ.com, which is the Wall Street Journal's website. I will tell you, I don't currently own this stock. I have owned it in the past, but I am buying it tomorrow. Literally, I am buying this stock tomorrow, so I will own it very shortly. And part of the reason that I'm buying it is because I started looking at it for this show, and I was like, "Wow, this is pretty good." Okay, so you know where I'm going to go with this stock, but. Let's talk about the founding of Nasdaq, and the guy who really created it or was behind the movement to get it started anyway. And that's Gordon Macklin. Gordon Macklin was born in Cleveland in 1928. He is now deceased. He died in 2007. He grew up in Shaker Heights, a Cleveland suburb. That's like kind of a nice suburb. I've been there before. All right, by 1950, he had graduated from Brown University with a bachelor's degree in economics. So Brown, he was in Rhode Island, Providence. So he returned to Cleveland from Providence to work for McDonald and Company Securities, where he eventually became partner. So he was obviously very skilled. A lot of Wall Street firms look down on these brokerage companies that are like based in the Midwest, but he clearly had some skills. He was elected president of the National Association of Security Dealers in 1970 and stayed on in that post through 1987. The National Association of Securities Dealers, so he was really respected. This is a big deal because it's like all these brokerages, all these companies have like a trade association. Now, what he did when he got there. And I should add, this is the organization that today regulates the Nasdaq market. And the Nasdaq itself stands for National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotations. Okay, so the Nasdaq, if you don't know, is a very prominent stock exchange, and it's done. A difference between the Nasdaq and the New York Stock Exchange is that it's done by computer. Okay. Shortly after becoming president of the National Association of Securities Dealers, he urged the organization to develop a quotation system, and that's how it started in 1971. So it used to be that you would have to go and, like, if you invested in a stock, you would have to go and look at the paper, open up the Wall Street Journal and look in the index, for your company that you invested in and see what the price is. And you could do it the next morning. But he wanted a system that would bring up the quotes so that you could see them, as the day went through and, as they changed in price during the day. It's not a revolutionary concept, but it's a very common sense, good idea. And by the early 70s, they had computers that were capable of doing it. So he wanted that. And by 1972, they had developed a way to use that quotation system for trading, which made a lot of sense. The way that stocks trade on the New York Stock Exchange is through a person, a human being, is responsible for selling and buying shares of stock. They call that guy the specialist. So if you might be the Microsoft specialist. So it's one guy, and all the traders have to go around, and tell them what they want to do. Sell 200 Microsoft, buy, 10,000 Microsoft, whatever. So it's not really the most efficient system, especially in this day and age, but that's still how it works. So in the New York Stock Exchange, but not in the Nasdaq. Okay, the type of trades that Nasdaq facilitates are called over-the-counter, which simply means they don't occur on a formal exchange with a trading floor. Brokers did not like the Nasdaq when it first came out because it narrowed the bid-ask spread. And what that means is that, if you want to sell, you might bid, you might ask for $20 a share of whatever company it is. And if you want to buy, you might say, hey, I'm willing to bid $22 a share. And the broker could be like, oh, yeah, okay, here, give me your $22. And then I'll just turn around and buy it for $20 so that they pocket the $2. That's a really simplistic way of saying it. But that's the process. They get to pocket some of that bid-ask spread. So the brokers didn't like it when suddenly you have this exchange where everyone can see how the prices are going and what the bid-ask is, and it narrows the spread between what is bid for a stock and what the person's asking. So they only get, instead of $2, 20 cents or something. Okay, but so the brokers didn't like it, but it became popular among investors. Obviously, I mean would be a great tool in the early 70s. So companies listed there. It's particularly attractive to high-tech and biotechnology companies. Nasdaq is like almost a synonym on Wall Street for high-tech companies that go there. So you think it's like a high-tech exchange because they view the trading floors as antiquated. So they prefer to go on the Nasdaq. Not everyone does. Like some had, Facebook had a bad experience with the Nasdaq when it first came out, went public. So it shifted to the New York Stock Exchange. Today, Nasdaq, the symbol is NDAQ, owns not only the Nasdaq but also 8 European stock exchanges. But let me tell you, these 8 European stock exchanges are piddling. It's like tiny little. It's the Armenian Stock Exchange, the Helsinki Stock Exchange, and then the Baltic states, Tallinn, Riga. So those are the capitals of Lithuania and Latvia. So those are just tiny little exchanges. The vast bulk of its earnings and revenue come from the Nasdaq Stock Exchange in New York. So this company trades at a PE of 23.68, has a dividend of 1.9%. Return on invested capital is 5.32%. So again, you have a bad comparison between price to earnings and return on invested capital. It looks very expensive. Net debt to equity is 60%. So no bonus from the balance sheet, just about average. However, here we go. Earnings expected to go up 45.6% for the fiscal 2016 year, which ends in February 2017. Huge, and I expect another huge amount of growth. So if I were to take the forward earnings, the PE is only 18.5, and that makes it look more attractive somewhat. Now, here's another thing that I like. The tax rate that they pay is 32%, which is high. So, they will benefit a lot if there is a tax cut from the Trump administration, as he says, as he's been talking about. So I like the company. It's positioned to do well, even if there isn't a tax cut. But I think there will be, and that will make its earnings even juicier. So even though the return on invested capital is kind of piddling over the last 12 months, that's really looking at 2015. I think it's going to go up a lot. I don't think the price is too expensive at 18.5 times forward earnings. That's like standard for the market, or even low for the market now. So I like it a lot. I say thumbs up on NASDAQ. The symbol is NDAQ, and I'm buying it tomorrow. And with that, we are all out of funny money.